Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. One of the most interesting and ambitious projects that's going on right now in public philosophy is the history of philosophy without any gaps. The host of that podcast, or I guess organiser of that project, has been someone I've known for a while now, Peter Adamson. He actually helped me get this podcast set up way back in the day. The latest book that's come out from that project is on Africana philosophy, which is what this episode is on. It's divided into two parts: philosophy in Africa pre-colonization, and then philosophy in the Africana diaspora post-colonization and post-transatlantic slave trade. This interview only covers the first half, pre-colonial African philosophy, but I think that's more than enough to be getting on with for one interview, and as you'll hear, I just had so many questions and things that I was interested to genuinely hear about within that, and hopefully that'll give you something of a taste for the book, which is very, very good. And so if you want to hear about the second half, which we do preview a little in this, I would recommend you get it, and I'll stick the link to that in the show notes. Also joining me along with Peter is Chike Jeffers, who is the co-author of this book with Peter and a subject matter specialist in it. I found this conversation really interesting, and if this is something perhaps that you haven't thought about before, I invite you to spend an hour with us learning about it. As always, if you like these conversations, please do consider supporting the show. I don't do any paid advertisements, I don't have any sponsors. All of the costs associated with this are made possible by the voluntary support of listeners, and thank you so much to everyone who does that. Actually, on the subject of which, my audio isn't great in a couple of moments in this. It's fine, but there's a couple of points where, like, the first second of what I'm saying is slightly garbled. I think both my computer and my microphone, which I'd both had for a long time, finally sort of gave out on me in the last few months. And I mention that because getting a new podcasting mic, much less a new Mac computer, are not cheap. And I would probably have had, I don't know really what I would have done, but for the support of listeners. So, like, it was my Patreon money that made the difference, that allowed me to just be like, okay, well, I'm just going to replace them. So really genuinely thank you to people who support, because you actually let me just keep doing the podcast as opposed to having to save up for a few months. So thank you genuinely so much for that. Apologies for a couple of moments. The guests are fine, but just for me in this interview shouldn't be a problem going forward. So yeah, let's get straight to it. This is Precolonial Africana Philosophy with Peter Adamson and Chike Jeffers. I am joined today by returning guest Peter Adamson and Chike Jeffers. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So, Peter, it's been a while. We were just discussing, it's been a while since you were last on the show. For people who aren't familiar, do you want to introduce them to the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps project, I guess you could call it now, more than podcast? And then, I guess, Chike, how did you come to be involved in it, and what's been your role?
Okay, sure. Well, I've been doing this since 2010. started in October 2010. And the idea was originally to cover more or less just European philosophy. And the slogan of the podcast was philosophy, the history of philosophy without any gaps, by which I just meant that I wouldn't jump forward in history. So I wouldn't like jump from, let's say, Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, but I would go from Aristotle to the students of Aristotle, which is what I did. And I always planned to include philosophy in the Islamic world in the project because that's actually my main area of specialization. But then people started saying, well, why are you calling this the history of philosophy without any gaps when you're not even covering China and India? And I eventually decided that was a good point. And in fact, now we've done classical India as well. And we're in the middle of doing China. I'm doing that with Karen Lai. I did India with Janardhan Ganeri. And between India and China, we did the series on Africana philosophy, which Chike can tell you about in a second. Maybe the only other thing to add is that, as you just said, it's more of a project than a podcast that has two big components. So one is the podcast, obviously, which is, I don't know, it's something like 800 episodes now because it's come out every week since 2010. But also there are books. So we use the written scripts for the episodes as the basis for a book, which we revise and sometimes add material. And this volume that's just come out is the first of two volumes on Africana philosophy and is volume 7 in the series. Volume 8 will come out pretty soon because it's already in production, and that's on philosophy and the Reformation. So there's quite a lot out there already.
Yeah, I mean, when I first met you, has to be a decade ago now, when this was sort of still in its earlier phases, I was like, I appreciate the ambition of the project, but there's just no way. There's no way. Like to even do like an introduction to everything that you're thinking of doing, it's a life's work. Like, and here we are, and you're doing it, and you're like through a lot of it.
You could put it that way. I have started to wonder how long I'll live, whether it will be long enough. I mean, I'm in my 50s now. When I started, I was about 40. So back then it didn't seem like an issue. But, we all have intimations of mortality, right?
Hmm.
But my intimations of mortality come with concerns about how many episodes I'll produce until then.
And Chica, yeah, how did you get involved?
Well, the thing with me is that I started as a fan. I was listening to the podcast from about the time that it started. And, I was one of many listeners, who worried about what it meant to say history, philosophy without any gaps, but have continent-sized gaps. And was, one of the voices encouraging the expansion of the podcast. And eventually, I left a message saying that if Peter wanted to talk about what would be involved in um, covering Africa, that's something I could speak to him about, given my own specialty as a professional philosopher. And so we had a Skype meeting, by the end of which he was clear that he wanted to go ahead with doing this Africana section of the podcast, right? Africana being a term that covers both Africa and the African diaspora. And so that's how it began. And um, unlike the Indian series and the current Chinese series, which uh, the Indian series that exists right now, only covers till I think uh, the first millennium AD or something like that.
Yeah,
So there's a
it
lot
goes up
more.
to Dignaga, so sort of late antiquity in European terms.
Right, right. And so there's the idea of getting back to that.
Hmm.
Um, there's the idea of sometime after he finishes the current series with Karen Lai, taking that forward to later Chinese as well as Japanese and Korean. Um, but with Africana, we tried to do the whole thing one shot. So it was a lot of episodes, 142. And the book that has just come out is Africana Philosophy from Ancient Egypt to the 19th Century. And then um, the next book, Africana Philosophy in the 20th Century, is going to be, in fact, even thicker than this present one. Um, and so we like to think that once those two books are out, we will have provided pretty unprecedented coverage of the area.
Talk to me just in basic terms about the meaning of Africana philosophy to you, because you mentioned it was both Africa and diaspora, and the structure of the book, the two big, I don't know how you'd say, but breaks are
Parts.
pre and post colonial, or as Africa and diaspora. Why? Yeah, let me just ask in basic terms, why is that a division that makes sense to you? What work is that doing?
Well, yeah, there are important questions about how to cover the history of philosophy in Africa, and you can compare sort of the way that uh, covering so-called Western philosophy has been pretty standardized, right? People often begin with the pre-Socratics, with Thales. That's how Peter originally began his series, right? Although, as Peter would agree, right, there are important questions about whether you should start with Thales versus, let's say, starting with someone like Hesiod or even Homer, right? And so, if these are, questions worth asking, right, there is, a much less standardized sense of what is to be covered by the term African philosophy, much less Africana philosophy. And uh, part of the issue is that the uh, world, as shaped by European colonialism, um, generally involved the idea that African philosophy is something of an oxymoron, right? And so, in challenging that and um, taking seriously the idea that there is something called philosophical thought in the history of Africa, which we can study, the question is, where do you begin? And where we begin in the first part of the book, which the first part is entitled Locating and Debating Pre-Colonial African Philosophy. The first thing we do is uh, take seriously the idea that Africa is the birthplace of philosophical thought, given certain, I would say, rather easy to defend assumptions about what philosophical thought is, and given the state of our knowledge about the development of the human species, right? There's good reason to think that philosophical thought is born where we are born, in Africa. So we begin there, but that, of course, does mean being very speculative about what is first developing um, as philosophical thought. And so, following that, we do begin to look at the history of recorded or written philosophy in Africa, focusing at first on ancient Egypt, although we do have a chapter as well on philosophy in ancient Mesopotamia, which we justify in the book as providing context for our look at ancient Egypt, but which also serves to bring Mesopotamia into the book series as a whole. Um,
Can I ask a few questions about those? Because I've actually been in ancient Mesopotamia a bit recently, literally, in a time machine. But no, I'm doing in a pale imitation of Peter, and I've just started it, a history of how the biblical texts came to be. And I'm trying to do that, as Peter would say, although I'm not taking his ambition, without any gaps. So I'm starting right with the ancient Mesopotamian antecedents and starting there. Um, let's start with Egypt though, because Egypt I know less, well, much less than Peter about the sort of pre-written philosophy side of things. But if you want to start with the written side of things, that is ancient Egypt, or at least Egypt and Mesopotamia. Hieroglyphs and cuneiform are the first two inventions of writing, right?
Mhm.
Talk to me about the corpus of texts in ancient Egypt, because I think from 1,000 yards, people think of ancient Egypt, they think of funerary texts, the Book of the Dead, and all that. What is there in those texts that is philosophically interesting, or what other texts are there that people think of less when it comes to Egypt?
Well, yeah, we do discuss the Book of the Dead in chapter 4, which is the first of our 3 chapters on ancient Egypt. Um, and what's interesting about discussing the Book of the Dead is actually kind of the philosophical puzzle we find in what are sometimes called the negative confessions. You know, the idea that as part of your journey to the afterlife, you will stand before gods and proclaim your innocence, what you have not done. And we raise the question of how likely it is that someone could actually make it there without having done any of the things that they claim not to have done.
Like I've never
But while
lied,
that,
for example, is one
right,
answer. I've
exactly,
never lied, not
exactly, you
once.
never told anything that was not completely true. Interesting, right? But interestingly, that is um, while we emphasize that has even been seen by later thinkers to provide a certain kind of foundation for ethics. Um, that wouldn't be what I think we treat as some of the most obviously philosophical material coming from ancient Egypt. Even in that same chapter, chapter 4, um, it seems to me that Akhenaten, who famously is known as the first monotheist, right? The kind of break with uh, Egyptian religious practices and beliefs that he announces, and also some of the philosophical implications in terms of his universalism, his naturalism. Um, it seems to me that that's actually pretty obviously philosophical, right? Including if you need philosophy, if you need philosophy to involve, right, questioning received wisdom, well, then that's clearly what he's doing, right? But then we go on in the 5th chapter to look at a very philosophically fruitful genre of writings known as instructions, right? And so this genre typically involves uh, like a father talking to often, his son and successor about what is important in living a good life, right? And so just the structure of the genre naturally leads to, weighty reflections on what is good in life, what one ought to do, and argumentative um, ways of pursuing those questions. And then there are two famous and important texts that we look at in the 6th chapter, The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant and The Dispute Between a Man and His Ba. And both of those, in some sense, involve narrative and dialogue. So there's something to be said about what you can get from the kind of narrative frame, but then um, it's actually a lot of the content of, in the case of the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, you have a peasant who's giving speeches because he is injustice has been done to him, and he's complaining about it to political authority. And so it ends up being a reflection on the very purpose of political authority, and the nature of Ma'at, which is an important ancient Egyptian concept, understood to be both justice and truth, right? In some sense, both of those two English terms are very much understood to be one in this concept. And the dispute between a man and his Ba involves a man debating with his soul, as the Ba is often translated, um, but debating with his soul over the value of life versus the value of death. And so uh, there's the philosophical question of what is valuable about life, what is valuable about death, and at the same time, given that it is a man debating with what is supposed to be, in some sense, his own essence, right? Then it also is a really interesting philosophical work about psychological fragmentation and complexity, what it means to be at odds with oneself, how one can regain psychological wholeness. So these are some of the texts that we focus on. And it should be mentioned that we provide here really just a cross section. There's so much more that we could have done. Um, if we really devoted uh, as many chapters as humanly possible to works of philosophical significance in ancient Egypt. So it does really strike me that for far too long, those who are interested in the history of philosophy have not been uh, given access or led to discover what is philosophically interesting in ancient Egyptian traditions, which when you think about how long you have writing traditions in ancient Egypt, it's perhaps unsurprising that there are many texts there waiting to be discovered and taken seriously.
If I could just add one thing there, I think one thing that actually surprised me when we covered this material, it wouldn't have surprised Chike because he'd already published on it actually, but I was surprised at how uncontroversial these examples of philosophy are. Like if you handed anybody the dialogue or the dispute between the man and his Ba and said, "What is that? Like, tell me what genre of writing this is." Well, they'd say, "Well, it's a philosophical dialogue." I didn't understand all of it, but it's a philosophical dialogue. It's sort of like Plato, right?
Right.
And it not only would be that be the first thing they would say, but they wouldn't have any further guesses or ideas about what it is. Like that's just it's just philosophy. It's a slam dunk case. I think the speeches in the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant may be a little bit more ambiguous because although there's this very strong theme of Ma'at, so justice slash truth, it's also like a very rhetorical text. So you might think that they're kind of set speeches or something like that. But on the other hand, the philosophical content is really right there on the surface. So although we do cover things in the book, so we'll be coming on to talk about oral philosophy in Africa, I guess, which is a much more disputed topic. So we do cover things where there's reason that there's like room for dispute as to whether this stuff is philosophy, in what sense is it philosophy, and so on. We actually start with things that are just very clear cases that no reasonable person could question, I would say.
Cool. Before we move on, though, I did want to ask, what's the connections to be drawn between, say, ancient Egyptian philosophy, philosophical thinking, broadly defined, and Mesopotamia? Because you've got two civilizations that are, trading, talking to each other for thousands of years. Or if you want to go into the Western canon, Greece, because there's a lot of claims about the origins of Greek philosophy drawing or talking to or talking from Egypt, some of which I know are quite controversial. But what's the to and fro between this civilization and its neighbors to either of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe two things to say here. One is what you just mentioned, which is the exchange between the cultures. So you have ideas and maybe even texts filtering across these supposed boundaries. For example, Thales, who's often thought of as the first pre-Socratic philosopher, supposedly went to Egypt and did some scientific activities there, right? And Plato and Aristotle both refer to Egypt as a kind of source of things like writing, actually. So Plato talks about the fact that writing was invented in Egypt. He says it was introduced by a god named Thoth. But he's right about the historical fact, whatever you make of the role of an Egyptian god. Aristotle also says that the arts and sciences originate in Egypt. I think as far as the Mesopotamian tradition goes, there's a further thing going on though, which is that whatever the historical connections, there's also an interesting parallel between types of text. So, for example, we have scientific works in cuneiform, and we have like the Tale of Gilgamesh, which in some ways might remind one of some of these more rhetorical texts, um, like the thing about the eloquent peasant, the tale of the eloquent peasant, or the tale of the sailor, the shipwrecked sailor from Egypt. So you can sort of put those next to each other, and even if you don't want to make any claims about trade routes or cultural contact, it's useful because you're getting a sense that there was this widespread kind of culture of texts of certain kinds in the Mediterranean basin, going all the way over to the Mesopotamian region. And so it kind of makes sense to cover them at the same time just because they pose the same kinds of challenges and opportunities, I would say. Would you agree with that, Chike?
The thing that I would want to say is the most obvious connection is actually the genre of instructions.
Right.
So it appears in both of these traditions. And one thing that we cover in both the third chapter when we were talking about Mesopotamia, as well as the fifth chapter on instructions in the ancient Egyptian tradition, um, we have cases where the father is giving the advice, which already is philosophical, uh, but in some interesting, unique cases in both traditions, we have cases where the son is talking back, challenging the father, right? And so again, to speak of sort of slam dunk cases of philosophy, right? If you think of philosophy as involving, debate and dispute, we have these interesting cases of debate and dispute in the tradition of the instructions, in the genre of instructions, which we find in both cases. The other really interesting thing to me when it comes to philosophy in ancient Mesopotamia, um, there are other dialogical works. So we talk about what's known as the Babylonian Theodicy, which seems very likely to have actually been an influence on the book of Job in the Bible. But there you have, you know, uh, again, kind of philosophical debate in dialogical form about the justice of the gods, in light of a man being, experiencing serious misfortune. And yeah, so uh I think that particular aspect, especially the genre of instructions, to me is an interesting way of tying the two traditions together.
It's really interesting having had my head in the Bible because that's exactly how I would describe the interconnectivity between ancient Mesopotamia and the Hebrew texts. Is people debate a lot to what extent we're looking at direct literary dependence, i.e., had the author of the Book of Job actually read some of these Babylonian texts, or were there sort of intermediate steps between? Another very famous example would be Law, had the author of the Covenant Code read Hammurabi's code, because there does seem to be some quite close parallels there. Or is it more that people are just sort of riffing on different traditions and proverb sayings and like everyone sort of knows the same stories? I'm more on the literary dependent side, but either way, what you can say is there are very clearly these genres of writing, much like we might have westerns or romance and so on. And whether or not there's a direct dependence, whether or not who made 310 to Omaha has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, they're both clearly part of a culture that knows what a western is and knows what like the sort of basic recurring themes of a western are enough to make one.
And just to give another example, here linking the ancient Egyptian tradition with the ancient Hebrew tradition. We discuss in chapter 5 the instruction of Amenemope, and there is a section of the book of Proverbs which scholars, I think that the majority of scholars who've looked at this do go in the direction of direct literary dependence because of the number of parallels between that section of the book of Proverbs and the instruction of Amenemope. And, part of what I think is interesting about what we do in the book is, we already are setting the instruction of Amenemope in this larger tradition with antecedents like the instruction of Ptahhotep, arguably the most famous of the instruction texts. And so there's this theme of silence as a virtue that comes down from Ptahhotep to Amenemope. And so it's interesting to see how the book of Proverbs seems to draw on the instruction of Amenemope and thus bring that theme into the ancient Hebrew space.
And the other, so I'll move on in a sec, but I could spend all day in this period. The other one that's really famous from ancient Egypt is you mentioned Akhenaten, the great hymn of the Aten. There are verses of that are very, very close to particular psalms, which is quite interesting because that's almost 1,000 year gap in time. Like we had, so just in terms of history rather than what religious traditions teach, we're looking at sort of 4 to 600 BC for most of the core biblical texts. It's not, Moses did not write this in 1500, but that means that stuff like even after Akhenaten's reforms were put down, some of these texts must have had a long afterlife if they're finding their way into stuff from other cultures 1,000 years later. That's like the Magna Carta to us or something like that. Anyway, I could spend a while on this. Peter, perhaps. We've talked a lot about written texts and the connectivity between them, but I think it's fair to say people were having discussions about what is right and wrong, how should one behave, prior to writing those discussions down. What can we say about that? We've talked about this before, but this is a side of things I'm much less confident in. How could we even begin to reconstruct or speculate about those sorts of conversations, given the nature of our evidence, and perhaps particularly in the African case?
Right. So this is a big part of the first part of the book, the uh, the part about locating and debating pre-colonial African philosophy. So that has, let me check, 21 chapters, of which 10 are devoted to the debate over oral philosophy in Africa. And not only the debate, but also to certain themes within oral philosophy in Africa. So things like ideas about time or personhood or divination, gender. So we didn't want to only talk about the meta level debate, although we do think that's extremely interesting, but we also wanted to give the reader a sense of what actually is there in terms of the material on which one can draw. So maybe we should start with that. So what is one looking at when one is talking about oral philosophy? Because does sound kind of impossible, right? So we're trying to figure out what traditionally was done in philosophy in Africa, but only in oral form, i.e., not written down. So how would we study that, given that we don't have a time machine, as you said before? And the answer is complicated. So for one thing, there actually are some material artifacts that one can look at. So you have things like artworks, right? Or just anything that you can find with archaeology. So a nice example would be that in the chapter on gender in oral traditions in Africa, we talk about archaeological digs looking at very long defunct settlements in Africa, where you can see that there was a women's area of the village and a men's area of the village, and there are different grave goods buried in the different parts, which tells you something about division of labor between men and women, right? Then you can pair that with things like proverbs or myths, we might call them, or legends, or religious claims that have been passed down orally from generation to generation and were still available to be recorded by ethnographers and anthropologists who traveled around Africa. I would say starting in basically the early 20th century or maybe late 19th century. So a lot of what we're drawing on in those chapters, actually, we looked at some pretty old publications, like things from ethnography journals from the 1920s, because ethnographers were saying, okay, I was in this village and this person said this to me, right? And they often weren't recording that. These scholars weren't thinking of themselves as studying philosophy, right? They thought of themselves as doing ethnography or anthropology. But actually, you can find remarks there, let's say proverbs about, the change of the world across time, which intimates some kind of conception of time or contrast between time and eternity, things like that. So that's really what we're talking about in terms of, as it were, evidence about the distant past. So physical remains of the distant past, and then oral culture that's been passed down to the present or the near present. And of course, there are difficult questions here about whether you can sort of hypothesize that something that was a proverb in the early 20th century in a rural African village would already have been a proverb in, let's say, the 16th century, right? Hard to say. So there's that. Then the other thing, though, is that some scholars of African philosophy thought it would be a good idea to make an active effort to go solicit philosophical ideas from people in what you might call traditional cultures around Africa. The most famous example of this being Henry Odera Oruka, who had this project called the Sage Philosophy Project, where he had the idea that instead of locating philosophy amongst groups of people, like the Akan say such and such about the nature of personhood, and the Yoruba say such and such about the nature of divination and how it works. His idea was, well, I or one of my assistants will go to rural Africa, will sort of rock up in a village and say, point me to the nearest wise person, which might be a man or a woman. He interviewed women as well as men. And they actually had a kind of philosophy questionnaire where they would go in and say, okay, tell me what you think about the relationship between men and women. Tell me what you think about the nature of time. And then these people would come up with these amazing remarks about these subjects. And he put all that together, probably took the highlights, I suppose, and he published this under the heading of what he called sage philosophy. So this was supposed to be a kind of compromise position on Oruko's part. So on the one hand, he was agreeing with the idea that you can find philosophy outside of a textual tradition. So this is just oral culture. But on the other hand, he agreed with critics of, say, of oral philosophy that you want philosophy to be done by outstanding individuals and not by whole peoples, right? Because if you think about European philosophy, we don't say, well, the Germans say such and that's the German philosophy, right? And so some critics of this kind of ethno philosophy project, as it was sometimes called, they would complain that you shouldn't be ascribing philosophical ideas to whole groups of people. You should be ascribing it to individuals. So that's kind of at least three sources on which one can draw, none of which involves written texts. So you have, like I said, material remains, you have ethnographic studies, often from about a century ago or later, and then you have active efforts to go find and interview philosophers. And all these things have kind of fed into this debate about oral philosophy in Africa.
Yeah, and what I'll add is that a major source of the material that we're looking at in these chapters would be professional philosophers from Africa in the 20th century, right? You have someone like Alexis Kagame, who is writing on um, Bantu thought in general, and especially he's from Rwanda, so focused on the Rwandan case. And in his work in the 1950s, he's especially interested in how the very structure of language and certain grammatical forms, in his view, have philosophical implications, right? So there's drawing on language, then, and then when you get to, the example of proverbs, um, and these were passed down orally, but of course you can write down what has been passed down. And so you have someone like Kwame Jeche, that's Gyekye from Ghana. And uh, he is especially focused on the philosophical significance of proverbs, the kinds of philosophical ideas that you can derive from proverbs. And by the time that Jeche is doing his work, right, the book that he writes on this comes out in, I want to say, 1987. So by the time he's doing that, there has already been a lot of debate about, um, as Peter said, this question of whether you can assign philosophical views to whole cultures, or whether that's wrong, and it's important to, only ascribe philosophical ideas to individuals. But Jeche says in response that, um, yeah, it's not that there is some collective mind that came up with each of these proverbs. Um, there are individual minds who came up with these proverbs, and the fact that the names of these individuals are lost to history because the proverbs have become a kind of communal property detracts in no way from their philosophical significance, right? And so that's an interesting argument for the presence of philosophy in oral traditions.
Yeah. Yeah, that another nice example to illustrate the point about language, which I should have mentioned in my set of sources you can draw on, would be if you go back to the example of time. There's a philosopher from Kenya named John Mbiti, who is quite prominent in this whole debate. So both as a proponent of oral philosophy and as a target of critique by later philosophers. And he has this famous thesis that Africans, and he just says Africans. So he's talking about like a subgroup of African languages, Bantu languages. And he says, well, Africans do not have a conception of an extended future. And he does appeal to certain cultural practices to support that idea, but his main argument is that that African languages, or at least the languages he was thinking about, don't have the kind of future tense constructions that we might be familiar with, let's say, English, right? So he said, a direct quote from what he said is that for Africans, time has a long past, a present, and virtually no future. And of course, this provoked a storm of controversy, both as a concrete claim about how Africans think about the future. So, for example, people came back and said, "Well, wait, I've studied an African people where they make contracts that don't come due until 20 years down the road, right? Like you'll get a cow in 20 years, right? So this can't be true." He was also criticized, I think rightly, for painting with too broad a brush. So you see this with a lot of the earlier work on so-called ethnophilosophy, that they'll kind of pick one African culture as their example, and then they'll say, well, Africans think such and such, right? Whereas in fact, of course, Africa has thousands of languages and many, many cultures that are very diverse. So trying to say anything about Africans as a whole seems like a pretty fruitless task on the basis of this or any other kind of argument. So there were methodological complaints, and then there were substantive complaints in terms of his claims about time. But nonetheless, I think it was a very kind of exciting project, and one that did inspire later work, because of course you can adjust for those problems, right? You can say, well, no, my claims are only about the Bantu. Okay, that's still a pretty big group, right? But I'm only talking about the Igbo, let's say, so a somewhat smaller group. And I'm still using grammatical features of the Igbo language to say that this is kind of how they see the world. And that raises all kinds of interesting issues about whether language shapes the way people see the world, whether the way people see the world shapes language, right? And this is really an issue that you can delve into quite deeply. And I think Mbiti should be credited with, not only Mbiti, other ethnophilosophers as well, should be credited with raising some very interesting methodological issues about philosophy here.
Definitely, we talked about this on our first interview. There's definitely a sort of obviously broad brush as that is a more defensible version of that because even not talking about Africa at all, there are clearly differences between how different cultures visualize and conceptualize time. But there's also differences within cultures on that. Like one of the things I've argued in my work is one of the things that distinguishes, say, American conservatives from American liberals from, say, socialist traditions is the sort of implicit conceptualization of social time that is happening there. That when they think about positive progress in a society, they're kind of picturing something different. Anyway, that's a different aside. But it doesn't seem wild to me to say there might be different plural conceptions of how time is visualized within a different tradition. That's like people see the world differently. That doesn't seem to me a wild claim. Obviously, you'd want to not just say Africans, but you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one thing that we really tried to emphasize in these chapters of the book is that, for example, when we have a chapter about God or gods, and one of the things we point out is that there were efforts to locate monotheism in Africa, which again, so often maybe this is sort of a sign of an earlier approach to this material that we probably wouldn't want to embrace today, but people would say, oh, they're monotheists, so they're actually rational. That's philosophical to be a monotheist, right? Which is problematic in all kinds of ways. But um, it's even, but the point would be that there are various kinds of monotheism in various African cultures and other cultures which don't seem to be monotheistic at all. So we actually have a wide range of different conceptions of the gods and or God, right? Or you have cases
Martin,
where there's different. Sorry, go ahead.
we talked about Akhenaten. He's often, and I think people have come back and tried to qualify this a bit today, but he's often held up as the first monotheist. And there's definitely something there's the word monolatry, which is more about exclusivity than existence. We didn't get into that, but there's definitely something monotheistic-ish about the Aten cult,
Yeah,
which is
for sure.
African and pretty old.
Yeah, and then in the context of oral philosophy, people talk about the Yoruba because they have this sort of king god named Olodumare, and then there are minor gods called the Orisha Nla. So Chika can correct my pronunciation. And so that's a complicated picture, which maybe looks more like, let's say, Neoplatonism, right? To take an example from that I'm familiar with from the Greek tradition. So you do have like a single god at the top who's overseeing everything, or maybe you could think of Zeus if you want, right? So a most powerful, most important god, and then a multiplicity of minor gods under that most important god. You could think, well, maybe these lesser gods are just manifestations of the one god, so it actually is monotheist. And basically, you have to try to have that argument for each and every culture within Africa, right? If you want to do this really seriously. So it's not an easy task at all, but also it's a very rewarding task.
Bit because I fear we will probably not reach the present day.
Mhm.
Once you get through, say, the turn of the eras, if you know, Egypt takes us into sort of Rome and that whole era. Once you get through that sort of ancient world proper, what sorts of written traditions do you get post that? So I know you talk about. I was actually in Ethiopia recently. There's quite an old written tradition there, right? In fact, some of the Christian documents we have specifically because of the Ethiopic Church. Do one of you want to tell us a bit about that, maybe particularly as it relates to philosophy?
Yes, we do look to Ethiopia, which has a written tradition stretching back uh, a very long time, and certainly by the time that um, Christianity becomes the official religion in the fourth century AD, you have going on from there a very interesting written tradition. Um, there has been a focus sometimes when looking at the Ethiopian tradition on texts that are ultimately translations, translations sometimes from ancient Greek into Ge'ez, the traditional literary and liturgical language of Ethiopia. Um, and at times, as you get later on in time, it's you've got texts originally written in ancient Greek that are translated into Arabic and then translated from Arabic into Ge'ez. So, with that side of things, you see the connection between Ethiopia and the Mediterranean world in interesting ways. Um, but in the first of our three chapters on Ethiopian thought, we spent some time on the Kebra Nagast, which is a traditional epic um, that is about the history of Ethiopia and rooting it in this story, of a queen, the biblical queen who goes to visit King Solomon, right? And that is the traditional story of how you get the first king of Ethiopia. Um, and the focus on the pursuit of wisdom in that text, we find to be an interesting philosophical theme. Um, but then, in the other two chapters, um, we have a focus on Zera Yacob and Walter Hewitt, who are from the 17th and potentially, um, wait, is it 16th maybe? 17th century, anyway, somewhere around there. Um, yeah, and there's controversy over whether those are authentic texts or whether they may have been written by this Italian guy who first found them and publicized them. Um, but especially with a new edition of these texts that has recently come out, um, the evidence, I think Peter and I both agree, is has mounted quite strongly in favor of the authenticity of the texts, even if, for example, it's possible that we don't have access to the texts as they were first written, that we have versions of them, right? And yeah, these texts are very interesting because Zara Yacob challenges the faiths with which he's familiar, especially the Abrahamic faiths, and uh, emphasizes depending upon your own rationality as given to you by God as a way of figuring out what is good, what is right, what is true. And so, especially because he's living at the same time as Descartes, right? He is sort of seen as a kind of almost a kind of Descartes figure in Ethiopia. But then you can make the contrast that, well, with Descartes, um, you know, you then have the Cartesians who come after him, and the debate, all the debates that then come with Cartesians and those who aren't Cartesians, as Peter is very currently covering in the series, the original series of podcasts. And whereas in the case of Zera Yacob, you have his mentee, Walter Hewitt, who also writes a book and is interestingly, I think, different from Zera Yacob. You know, uh, I've always said that if it is actually the case that these are forgeries, I mean, it's just truly one of the most interesting cases of making something up that you can imagine in terms of the ways that you see different approaches to how culturally rooted Zera Yacob and Walter Hewitt's texts are. Like there's more quotations from a lot of traditionally common literature in Walter Hewitt as opposed to Zera Yacob. There's ways in which you can maybe even wonder sometimes if Walter Hewitt is somehow balancing an attachment to various traditional ideas with what he has learned from his iconoclastic teacher. Um, uh, And the other thing to say is that texts uh, in Ethiopia, the easiest way for texts in Ethiopia to be preserved was through churches, and Zer Jacob and Walter Hewitt are very obviously, explicitly, you could say, heretical, right? And so there's this way in which, you know, it may seem weird that these texts are rediscovered in the 19th century, and you know you can't find, for example, um, other sources that are confirming, oh, that I knew this person, right? Like the kinds of things that would help us feel sure that these persons existed, and that this and the Italian guy in the 19th century didn't make them up. And it'd be nice if we had that, but you can sort of understand why these texts would have been transmitted, you know, in a more sort of underground kind of manner. And it's just the way that things went that, after Walter Hewitt, we don't seemingly have an extension of that tradition. But the two texts by themselves are fascinating. They're, some of the most interesting works, especially when you try and um, narrow what you're looking at to like pre-colonial African philosophical texts. I mean, they're really groundbreaking and interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And then on the other side of Africa, we cover West Africa and the spread of Islam to West Africa. So this actually allowed me to retroactively amend or maybe fill another gap. So just as I should have started with Egyptian and Babylonian philosophy when I did the project in the first place, and I kind of had an opportunity to fill that gap here. When I did philosophy in the Islamic world, I didn't really get into philosophy in Africa beyond, or philosophy within the Islamic world in Africa beyond Northern Africa. So like Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco. Um, and here we looked at the manuscript tradition in Timbuktu. We looked at the Sokoto Caliphate. We looked at debates about slavery within Islam in West Africa. So there's a couple of chapters about that as well. So I mean, if you think of the first part is basically has four components, I would say. So there's the idea about prehistoric Africa. So, using cave paintings. So what GK started with in our conversation. Then you've got ancient Egypt, Ethiopia, and Islam. So those are the kind of textual traditions that we have to work with. And then the last part is oral philosophy. So those are the kind of things that we talk about is prehistory, various written traditions, and then philosophy outside of written traditions. Maybe that's three parts. I forget what I said, how many parts it would be, but that's what we do in the first part of the book.
Tell me a little more. I'd be super interested to hear, and I think we'll probably just have to content ourselves with this interview being the pre-colonial side, but I think there's more than enough there to make an interesting conversation. About the Timbuktu tradition and particularly debates about slavery, and if you wanted to give maybe a little, because obviously I think this might be less known than, say, the transatlantic slave trade, a little bit of context of what that particular slave trade looks like and what the debates were about it.
Right. This is a well-known fact that slavery exists in many, if not most, pre-modern cultures, right? So you've got it in Rome, you've got it in ancient Greece, you've got it in ancient Egypt, you've got it in ancient India as well, right? There's a kind of weird thing that Alexander the Great went to India, right? And one of the scholars he brought with him, a historian, reported that here's an amazing thing about ancient India. There's no slaves, right? And this is a good piece of evidence of how little they learned about the culture they were visiting because they absolutely have slaves. We have ample evidence for that, right? So again, in Islam, there is slavery. There is a very strong norm against enslaving Muslims, against Muslims enslaving other Muslims. And then the question is kind of, well, for maybe one interesting question would be, why would that be? Another interesting question would be, well, what are Muslims allowed to do to other non-Muslim peoples? And we talk about an author named Ahmed Baba who writes a treatise about slavery and kind of considers its status within Islam. So, uh, and just in general, I mean, we know that there was a slave trade in West Africa, when sort of within the purview of Islamic culture. And of course, historians of slavery have thought about the relationship between that and the later, much larger scale slave taking that went on as part of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, and one thing that oh, sorry. Yeah, and I'll add that there is an interesting way in which, the trans-Saharan slave trade not only precedes and arguably uh, anticipates the transatlantic one in certain ways, but sort of, modern questions of race. Um,
That was just what I was going to ask about. Yeah.
yeah, so modern questions of racial difference are already, or what would seem to be what we would call a racial difference, right, are being raised in this Islamic context, right, because of the difference between sub-Saharan and Northern Africans. And so Ahmad Baba, for example, is responding to those who treat um, Black people as enslavable regardless of religion, and uh, defending the importance of making the Muslim non-Muslim distinction. Um, so that's one interesting part of things. I mean, Ahmad Baba himself didn't consider himself to be Black, as we discussed, but it is interesting that to think of Timbuktu as uh, a site of philosophy. We talk about how one of his mentors was clearly a Black African, and what is the relationship there doing to shape his ideas?
Is this where? Because I've heard sort of in terms of like anti-black racism, I've heard several sort of origin parables. One says, it's Westerners who go about enslaving, and they sort of import, say, the British ideas about the Irish as subhuman. They kind of carry over, is one origin story I've heard. There's others that do mention the trans-Saharan slave trade as where a lot of these sort of specific ideas developed. The person I know who knows about this sort of says it's not one thing. It's not like suddenly people woke up one day and went, this is the difference between people, and this is, it evolved over centuries. But is this part of that story, the sort of preceding slave trade in the Islamic slave trade prior to? Is this where we start to see some of those ideas coming in?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting that actually, to go back for just a second to Akhenaten,
Mm,
um, you know, Akhenaten himself, while praising the Aten, um, again, one of the interesting things about the monotheism that he's developing is that it seems to give him um, a sense of the world's unity, right? And there's even, I would argue, a kind of standard Egyptocentrism, if we can put it that way, that he seems to reject once he is thinking of everybody as, created by and cared for in some sense by this one God, the Aten. And so, even in that context, he mentions that, that the Aten has differentiated people by tongue and by skin, right? And so, how do we relate that, to questions of race, right? And the thing that I would say about that, right, is when you think of where Egypt is, right, the kind of crossroads of the world, if we can say, that you get in the Mediterranean area, um, right? It's kind of obvious, with Egyptians being familiar with, um, the people they called Asiatics up in Palestine, but then also being familiar with the Nubians to the south of them. And we know, while there's there's all this controversy about how we position Egyptians racially. What does it mean to call them black or not black? Right. It does tend to be somewhat uncontroversial that we will call the Nubians black, right? That they would be phenotypically black Africans. So you can think of how even in Akhenaten there we have a reflection on being in the part of the world that helps you be familiar with the diversity of how we look as human beings. And so, yeah, it seems to me that by the time you get to um, the golden age of Islam, um, then you have, yeah, this large chunk of the world carved out through the spread of Islam that is once again bringing together places of the world in which people look different. And there we do, it seems to me, have, yeah, these interesting precursors. If we want to differentiate it from modern racism as practiced by European imperialists, nevertheless, it does seem sort of obvious that there are ways in which you're getting anticipations of that.
Yeah. There's actually there's a ninth century Islamic author named Jahiz who wrote a book called On the Superiority of the Blacks, which is not something you'd do if it wasn't an issue, right? And he's a kind of perverse, ironic literary figure. So it's quite easy to imagine that he was somehow trying to overturn prejudice against Black people, and that's why he would have written a book like this. But I think as far as I'm not a historian of slavery, except insofar as I learned a lot about it trying to write this book. But it's certainly not my specialist field. But my sense of the Islamic material, at least, is that the real issue for them is Muslims versus what they call pagans. So if you look at the Sokoto Caliphate, so that's in Nigeria, and that is Muslims trying to suppress, often pretty brutally suppress, pagan religious practices because they consider it to be anathema to Islam as a monotheistic religion. And so what Ahmad Baba is saying is, look, even though we Muslim settlers are mostly for now mostly not visibly black, so to speak, and although a lot of these pagans look black, don't get confused, because what allows you to enslave someone is not that they're black. That's irrelevant. It's that they're pagan, right? And it's not like we want to celebrate the fact that they were enslaving pagans, right? But the point is that that he was just trying to state what he, I think, took to be a completely obvious fact within Islamic culture / law, namely that race has nothing to do with the permissibility of slavery. So I think it's pretty hard to imagine getting from that to sort of directly to the exclusively race-based slave practices that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. That's just not what's going on in West African Islamic slavery, at least not according to Ahmad Baba.
You see a similar tension within Christianity, but then in Christianity, at least in the American case, the race-based instinct just wins out. But there is a long history in Christianity about that uncomfortability of enslaving other Christians, even if they're not of the same race or whatever. There's long been a teaching that you don't enslave Christians, period. But I mean, I know Islamic history much less. Certainly in the Christian tradition, there's also a long history of that religious precept being pretty consistently ignored. That when it comes to what happens on the ground, people find ways around it or just ignore it. And then once you get into the American case proper, just fully embrace it. Yeah, we have Christians enslaving other Christians, and that's fine because race,
Yeah. Yeah, the rationale is often that they're Christians in theory, but they're very bad Christians. Because they're, weak-minded or whatever the excuse is. And so we're going to enslave them in part to religiously educate them. And then Frederick Douglass, someone like him, will say, well, if you're interested in religiously educating your slaves, why don't you let them learn to read so they can read the Bible, right? And so that it's very easy to point out the hypocrisies involved in that for someone as intelligent and perceptive as Douglass.
So now, bringing this forward because we'll be here for another hour if we go into
Mhm.
post-colonial. I don't want to say when I'm sort of inquiring about antecedents of sort of American race ideology in the Islamic world, as an exculpatory exercise, they invented it. We're not to blame. My understanding is that it's certainly there, but perhaps not quite as fanatical as it becomes in the transatlantic case as defining everything, and the countervailing instinct of one doesn't enslave one's co-religionists, while often ignored, is perhaps a bit more stronger and a bit more of a barrier than it would be in the Christian case, where it's almost uniformly ignored.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
No, I'm sort of asking for my own knowledge here, like just to get it straight in my own head.
I don't know. It does seem to me that the fact that Ahmad Baba writes his text is a sign that um, that something like what later comes along with the Europeans has become so popular among the Muslims of his time that he feels the need to make this distinction and to say um, that being black is not a sufficient reason for being enslaved, right? And so,
Which kind of
yeah, I
implies there must have been people who did think that he
Yeah.
feels the need to rebut it.
yes, yes, yeah, and so um, slavery is this very interesting topic in the history of Islam, and I think, as Peter rightly points out, when looking at, say, the Sokoto Caliphate, right? Um, Everyone in the context there, you're talking at that point about, what is present day Nigeria. You're talking about the Hausa and Fulani, and uh, the, I mean, everyone is black in that context, so to speak. And so race is not the issue. And then interestingly, to bring up Zara Yaqub again, um, Zara Yaqub associates slavery with Islam in a way that seems unfair historically, but you know, whatever is unfair about it, there's something telling that when Zara Yaqub argues that that all human beings are brothers and therefore no one should be allowed to enslave anyone, he directs that at Islam. And also, when he's directing that argument at Islam, there too, he doesn't bring up religious difference. Sorry, he doesn't bring up racial difference, right? And so there's this way in which the topic of slavery, is coming up in various ways in relation to Islam. But it does seem to me that one of the things that we do have to pay more attention to is how, whether going back to Al Jahiz, who Peter mentioned, who may have been himself a black writer from Iraq, and there seems to be this question over whether the text was uh, an ironic um, expression of anti-black racism or a serious defense of black people against anti-black racism, or whether you get to Ahmad Baba. Uh, yeah, it just seems to me that again, there's going to be things we can say about how different it is once you get the transatlantic slave trade there, once you get the extent of European colonialism and how much it draws together the entire world, right? But we have all these new thoughts about race in the context of European imperialism drawing the world together, right? I think going back in time, what you just see is different ways in which less of the world was drawn together, right? Whether by, you can think about this in the context of the Roman Empire, right? And as I said, even going all the way back to, you know, ancient Egypt, right? There's, um, when different peoples from different parts of the world who look different are drawn together somehow socially, then, on occasion, people are going to remark upon it. And it's not going to look the same as what we know when, for example, everywhere but Antarctica is known, right? But yeah, it seems to me that medieval Islam, and you can actually also find Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, making uh, comments about Black people. Um, but that's the medieval Islamic world, right? The medieval Islamic world, to me, is drawing together people in such a way that these questions of how people look different and what does that mean, just they come up. And I think I really do think that we have uh, paid too little attention to that, and that it has to be more part of the story, like you say, not as part of some exculpatory "you're off the hook, Europeans." It was the Muslims who did it, right? That's not the point, but but it's the best way to understand how this becomes a theme in human thought, I think.
Interesting, thank you. So to close, would one or both of you maybe like to sort of talk about what's the relevance of the pre-colonial African philosophical traditions today? What's the sort of so what here? What's the use value or just interest in studying them and continuing to think about them?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first because that might be a chance to say just a little bit about the second half of the book.
Hmm.
So one thing that we got pushback online about this, and I must say I myself wondered about it when we were working on the project. Why would you think that what we're calling Africana philosophy is sort of one unified thing? So you've got ancient Egypt, you've got Ethiopia, right? So those textual traditions are separated by many centuries. They're in different languages. Then you've got West African Islam. Then you've got these oral traditions. What does that all have to do with each other, other than that it's all happening in Africa? And one answer would be that from the point of view of 19th and 20th century diasporic and African philosophy, those things are just absolutely crucial, seen as absolutely crucial background for later African thought and also diasporic Africana thought. So you'll see, for example, 19th century African American figures, like again, we can mention Frederick Douglass, but he's only one of many examples, who will quote passages in the Bible like Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God, or they will refer back to the building of the pyramids, or the Queen of Sheba and her relationship to Solomon. Basically, all the stuff that we covered in the first half of the book. The people who are writing in the 19th century look back to all of that and claim that as their heritage. And I think that becomes even more explicit once we get to the 20th century, which is what we'll cover in the next book. So you have like Pan-Africanism, where many of the leading political figures in Africa are trying to draw on that sort of legacy to motivate a political project for pulling together as many African nations and peoples as possible in order to resist colonialism. So that kind of resources that pre-colonial African thought offers to later Africana thinkers is something that kind of unifies everything we talk about in retrospect, because you can't understand 19th and 20th century African and Africana diasporic thought without knowing what they're talking about. They're talking about Egypt, they're talking about Ethiopia, they're talking about oral traditions, right? All the time. It's just a constant kind of theme within 19th and 20th century Africana thought. And so as we were going through it, I myself kind of came to see it as a much more unified body of material than I had perceived it as being at the beginning. And of course, Chike knew that the whole time, and he was sort of like, "Don't worry, we'll get there." And in retrospect, it really does make a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah, and I'll also try and relate the two parts of the book in my answer as well, because it is interesting that chronologically, um, you know, by the time that we get to um, the 11th chapter, which is the chapter on the Sokoto Caliphate, right? We are looking actually there at 19th century writing, right? And when we begin the next section, slavery and the creation of diasporic Africana philosophy, we spend the part of the first chapter of that section talking about a man named Juan Latino, who is living and writing in Spain back in the 16th century, right? He publishes his book of poetry in, I want to say, 1573 or something like that, right? And so we've gone backwards in time in that sense, right? But that's part of what's interesting about that, right? Is you can kind of see, like when we mentioned how the Sokoto Caliphate, right? Race is not so much the issue there. It's Black West Africa and the Muslim versus pagan distinction that is very foremost there, right? There is a way in which, at that point, you are still looking at philosophical thought in Africa where there's not yet the shadow of European dominance, if I can put it that way. And one of the things that I've said in a piece that I published called "Thoughts on the Structure of the History of Africana Philosophy," which was inspired by this work that we have done. There is a sense in which I share with Juan Latino, right, the identity of being an Africana thinker living and working in the shadow of European dominance. That is, having been affected by the way that through slavery and colonialism, you now have African peoples and people of African descent thinking philosophically in European languages, trying to understand what that means, how to understand the Western tradition, how to understand their relationship to indigenous African traditions. And so, yeah, that's what we get into, right, in that second section of the book, how especially in the 18th and 19th century, you have people who were born in Africa sometimes, like Anton Wilhelm Amo and Phyllis Wheatley, writing in Latin and in English, right? And then, of course, as you get into the 19th century, we're looking at folks born in the United States or also Haiti or also Trinidad or also Brazil, right? Just to name some of the places that we're looking at, in that part of the book. But I think that, yeah, Peter and I agree that you need that background, right, of the pre-colonial to properly contextualize how these people of African descent are now coming to terms with the huge disruption that the slave trade and European colonialism introduces into these African worlds.
Thank you both so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.